we have at the same time the Global Times issuing another editorial talking about how these latest probes into foreign interference into Australian universities by China is politically motivated, that Canberra is just following blindly the moves of Washington. Is the detainment of Cheng Lei the collateral damage out of all of this?
Well, good morning, Heidi. Thank you for having me. Look, it's too early to say. It looks like that on the surface, absolutely, but let's hope it's not, because this then would take the relationship to an even lower depth from the very low levels it already has reached.
Is the Foreign Minister and DFAT doing enough to secure her release? What would you gauge is happening behind the scenes at this point, given that they've known that she was detained for at least 2 weeks now?
Yes, and I think there's been a lot of activity behind the scenes, culminating in the Foreign Minister's announcement late yesterday. I think DFAT and the Foreign Minister are doing the right thing. They're sticking to a script which is following a low-profile approach in public, reinforcing, as the parent statement did yesterday, their confidence in China's due process. And I think it's very important that these sort of matters are handled behind the scenes. And I'm sure that there's an enormous amount of activity going on by the embassy and at higher political levels.
Does the symbol of this, the way that it's being carried out, sort of alarm you? Because previously, of course, we've seen foreign media, foreign journalists working for overseas networks targeted and have a difficult time, particularly when it comes to visa renewals and censorship and the such, whilst working in China. But this is a journalist who has had a long tenure at state-run television. So does this tell you that it sends a message that really no foreign person in China at the moment is safe?
That could be one way to read it, Heidi. It's still too early, I think. I know Cheng Lei very well, and she's a very good personal friend, so it's obviously distressing to see what's happened. But it's a very, very sensitive role in Chinese state-run media. They could have targeted other foreign journalists, Australian journalists rather, if this is the game they're playing. So I'd have to reserve judgment for the time being, but it is a very powerful message that's being sent.
How does Australia kind of go from here, right? Because we have seen just a steady ratcheting up of bilateral tensions. Of course, we're now looking at a second anti-subsidy probe into Australian wine. We saw the announcement of the inquiry into foreign interference into Australian universities just earlier this week. Does it surprise you how quickly relations have deteriorated, and how do we steer things back onto the right track? Do we have to wait until after the November US election for a better gauge?
Yeah, look, on the first point, it does surprise me. We're in a very serious tit-for-tat downward spiral, and I think fault lies on both sides. You'll recall last week, for some unexplained reason, the Treasurer decided to stop a major Chinese dairy company acquiring a Japanese-owned dairy business, Lion Nathan, in Australia. And it was simply a sale from a Japanese company to a Chinese company in Australia. It's hard to see a cow as being of national security interest, but I think that's the state that the relationship has now reached. And the day after the Chinese deputy at the Chinese embassy made a conciliatory speech at the National Press Club, the Prime Minister announced a review of agreements made by states and universities with foreign governments, and for foreign governments, please read China. So there is a tit-for-tat downward spiral going on, and it's hard to see where the floor to this is, not least because there is no contact directly between the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister or Trade Minister and their Chinese counterparts.
Geoff, of course, we are seeing the tensions between China and Australia, but also the military standoff between China and India continue on top of the tensions with the US, the UK, also Canada. How big of a risk is it for Beijing if we have a Biden presidency and the launch of a multilateral alliance that could pressure the Chinese government and China's foreign policy?
Yes, I think a Biden presidency would be a great concern to Beijing, precisely for the point that you make that a Biden presidency will be much more assiduous in cultivating the alliance relationships, not only in the Asia Pacific, but also in Europe. And China will have to recognise it was going to face a much more united front internationally if it tries to continue its assertive behaviour. There are real risks there, but equally, I think a Trump administration will continue to keep the pressure on China. So the question is, how far is Beijing prepared to keep pushing on the limits of tolerance of neighbouring states and the international community more generally?